Assalamu alaikum students, welcome back to class, and we're currently doing the essay on self-reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson. We've had a few classes where I have tried to explain to you Emerson's philosophy of life and how he gives importance to the individual. As the name states, this is an essay that concentrates on how man needs to depend on himself and his own values, his concepts, his thoughts and ideas have primary importance. Emerson has tried to give, with the help of several examples, he's tried to make us convinced of the fact that the individual must depend on himself. In the previous lessons that you've had with me, Emerson has been trying to emphasize the role of the individual. And when I say the individual, what I actually mean is the common man, the man in the street, not some philosopher, some high-sounding philosopher or poet or wise man, but the individual, the common man, the ordinary human being. Throughout the previous essays that we've been studying, the lectures that we've had on Emerson's self-reliance, you will have noticed one thing, and that is the extent to which Emerson holds the individual responsible for whatever happens. Just to recap very quickly what we did in the last lecture, Emerson has been trying to emphasize the significance, the importance that the individual has in this scheme of things. And what I tried to explain to you in the previous lecture was how Emerson emphasizes the fact that we don't need to read the ideas expressed by great philosophers. You know, we are literature students. For everything in English literature, we go back to the Greeks, and specifically Greek philosophers. We quote Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. If we study English drama, we go back to Greek tragedy and how Greek tragedy forms the basis of even contemporary drama. So for everything, we go back to the classics. And we give references constantly of the significance of classical literature, of how classical literature forms not only the base of English literature, but also gives a lot of the material, a lot of the style that is used in English literature and that has been used in English literature throughout the centuries, to the extent that even contemporary American literature, or for that matter the literature of any place in the Western Hemisphere, depends to a great extent on Greek literature and Greek thought, Greek philosophy. So what Emerson is trying to say here is that it's not important for us to quote examples from the past, from great philosophers and poets and wise men, because those people are dead. And just as their bodies have decayed and deteriorated, and they have been forgotten as individuals, as human beings, just as their physical self has been forgotten, so must we also forget what they wrote and give importance to what the man in the street is saying. Now, that's very easy to say. It's difficult to put into practice, because what Emerson is emphasizing here is how we need to depend on ourselves. I need to depend on myself, not what another person is saying or what another person is telling me or what my ancestors did. This is my time. I need to depend on myself. I need to make maximum use of my own resources, not the resources that somebody who's dead and gone left for me. So in essence, what he's saying is that we need to take responsibility. We need to have ownership of what we're doing. Because when we borrow thoughts and ideas from people who are no more, then we also assign responsibility to those people. So he says that we should not borrow ideas or thoughts from our ancestors or from classical thought from antiquity, but we must seek for ideas in our own world. We must look at people around us. We must see what we have and utilize what we have to the maximum. Okay? So he has emphasized the fact that the individual, the current day contemporary individual must stop relying on outside forces, on outside agents, and start to rely on himself or herself and see what he or she can contribute, because whatever an individual in this world today can contribute is far better than what was contributed by people living, let's say, 1,000 years ago or 400 or 500 years ago. Okay? So total reliance on the self and not on external forces, not on outside agents. So let's see what Emerson has for us today. The last lecture we had wound up where Emerson says that if I invite a great man to my house, I do not wish to please him. I wish for him to please me. So he's putting the self above everything else. And we'll take on from where we left off. So he says, I'll stand here for humanity, and though I would make it kind, I would make it true. Let us affront and reprimand the smooth mediocrity and squalid contentment of the times, and hurl in the face of custom and trade and office the fact which is the upshot of all history, that there is a great responsible thinker an actor working wherever a man works, that a true man belongs to no other time or place but is the center of things. So total and absolute reliance on the self, not just on the self but on the present moment, the present place. So the present holds primary importance for Emerson. And if the present holds primary importance, then the present individual, the present time is the most important for Emerson, and not a person who lived 500 years ago, not a place that was important 500 years ago. The present, the here, the now, and the individual who is in the present are what makes up Emerson's world, and that's what must be given credit. That is what must be held responsible, and not some dead and gone person in a dead and gone time, in a dead and gone place. Okay? So where he is, there is nature. Wherever the individual is now is the center of the world. The here, the now is the center, the most important thing in the world, the most important place in the world, and the most important person in the world is the individual who is in this world and in this particular place now. He measures you and all men and all events. So the individual has a load of knowledge, a lot of information about the past, about people around him, and other spaces, other places. So he has that to measure everything against. But what is important is the here, the now, and the person who is who's present now. Ordinarily, everybody in society reminds us of somewhat else or of some other person. You try to do something and they'll say, yes, you've done fine, but what so-and-so did is better. That is something that Emerson says we must avoid. Character reality reminds you of nothing else. It takes place of the whole creation. The man must be so much that he must make all circumstances indifferent. So you have to make sure that whatever you're saying is of primary importance. Whatever you're doing is of primary importance. The here, the now, and the individual who is present in the here and the now are what is the most important. People will tell you things. Emerson says society will very frequently say, oh, such and such a person did something really wonderful. What they're actually trying to do is detract somewhat from what you have done. But do not let that upset you. He says society can make comparisons for all as much as society wants to, but you should not let that upset you. You have to be convinced that you are the most important person, that this present time is the most important time, and this place is the most important place in the whole wide world. So the man must be so much that he must make all circumstances indifferent. What's happening now has to be more important than what happened yesterday. It has to be more important than what happened last year or in the last century. So the here and the now with the individual who is present now is what is most important. Every true man is a cause, a country, and an age, requires infinite spaces and numbers and time fully to accomplish his design, and posterity seems to follow his steps as a train of clients. Okay, so he says every true man is a cause, a country, and an age. The emphasis that he is placing is on the individual, what the individual is doing right now, and the place in which the individual is doing it. So the contemporary individual in a particular time, in a particular place, is what forms the center of the world. And once he is convinced and once he acts like he is the most important person, he is the most responsible person, then posterity or those people who come after him will automatically follow what he is doing, what he is saying. And you have to remember the examples that Emerson gave of Shakespeare and Milton and Aristotle and Socrates and all the other great philosophers and great thinkers. He said those people did not follow the examples of anyone else. Shakespeare, for example, did not follow the example of anyone else. Whatever he wrote was individual, was his creation. He borrowed ideas, but the style was his own, and Emerson says that is one reason why his works were so successful and are still popular to this day. But because they depended on their own talent on the present moment, therefore we individuals also must focus on our own talent, our own innate abilities, and not look around for ideas. A man Caesar is born, and for ages after we have a Roman Empire. Christ is born, and millions of minds so grow and cleave to his genius that he is confounded with virtue and the possible of man. Now he's bringing in two ideas here which he's going to develop in the next slide, and that is that we put too much emphasis on individuals in the past. He says a Caesar is born, and we start thinking that the Roman Empire will last forever. But it did not. It declined and it fell. It finished off. So just because a Caesar is born and he strengthens the foundation of the Roman Empire does not mean that Caesar or the Roman Empire will live forever. They do not, they will not, they have not, and they cannot. In the same way, he says, Christ is born and millions of people think that they are saved because Christ was born in a particular place at a particular time. So he says you can't shift responsibility onto an individual who is no more, just as you cannot take credit for what somebody else has done. You have to give credit where it is due, but you must also concentrate on the present moment and not on something that happened in the past. So he says an institution is the lengthened shadow of one man. The problem, he says, is that we associate institutions with individuals. This is not how it should be. And he gives you examples. He says monarchism became very popular, but it was associated with the hermit Antony. That is, the desire to leave this world and to go and live far away from the world is something that was started by the hermit Antony, who just became sick and tired of the world, and he said, I'm going to go and live in a place where I do not see any human beings. So monarchism is something that's associated specifically with Antony because he's the one who established it as an institution. In the same way, Martin Luther is associated with the Reformation, and whenever there is talk of Reformation, people quote the examples of Martin Luther. But according to Emerson, Martin Luther is dead and gone, and therefore he should be forgotten also. And then he talks about Methodism and abolition, and then he comes on to something different. And he says, Scipio, Milton called the height of Rome. And all history resolves itself very easily into the biography of a few stout and earnest persons. So because Milton thinks very highly of Scipio, therefore all Roman senators become people who are revered, people who are admired and appreciated. But according to him, that is not so. Just because you have one Scipio does not mean that Rome is full of philosophers. That's not the case. And so we must not expect a Scipio, a Caesar, an Antony rising from within us. We cannot expect that until we have enabled ourselves to take on that responsibility. Let a man then know it's his worth and keep things under his feet. Now this is something that's very important. He says, let him not peep or steal or sulk up and down with the air of a charity boy, a bastard, an interloper in the world which exists for him. Man is the crown of creation, right? So if man is the crown of creation, then this whole world has been created for man. So what Emerson says, don't be distressed, don't feel sad about this, because once an individual knows his worth, then he can take on the whole world. Then there are no issues with any responsibilities. Let him not slink along like an interloper or a bastard, etc., etc. But the man in the street, finding no worth in himself which corresponds to the force which built a tower or sculptured a marble god, feels poor when he looks on these. So he says you have to give the man in the street confidence. If you don't do that, the man in the street looks around him, reads about the great people, and considers himself to be a non-entity compared to those great people. So what Emerson is saying is that we must have confidence in the individual, not in some celebrity, not in a great philosopher who is no more, but the man who is living his life now. He must know his worth. He must be given importance. And he gives you the reasons why. He says, the man in the street, finding no worth in himself which corresponds to the force which built a tower or sculptured a god, feels poor when he looks at these. The ordinary man, when he looks at what is around him, and when he hears people talking about these wonderful things that have been accomplished by men in the past, he feels very small. He feels ignorant. He feels frustrated. He feels depressed. He feels inadequate. He feels that he cannot compare with a person who has sculpted a marble god, for example, and the reference, is to the great Italian sculptors, to the great Italian artists. So he says that somebody who's built a tower or who has made a beautiful work of art, when you praise such a person or when you praise that work of art in front of an ordinary person, the ordinary person feels frustrated. He feels inadequate because he cannot do it. But according to Emerson, you must give importance to the ordinary man because to him a palace, a statue, a costly book have an alien and forbidding air, much like a gay equipage, and seem to say, "Who are you, sir?" Yet they all are his. And this is very important. I want you to focus on these lines. They all are his, suitors for his notice, petitioners to his faculties, that they will come out and take possession. The picture waits for my verdict. It is not to command me, but I am to settle its claims to praise. Okay? So, the ordinary man feels inadequate, feels inefficient, because other people have done such wonderful things. But Emerson's point of view is that the ordinary man is the most important person in the world. The man who's living now is the most important person ever, because all these things that have been made are there for his approval. If Leonardo da Vinci makes a Mona Lisa, he does not make it for himself, he makes it for the ordinary man in the street to praise. Because it's not the artist who is going to praise his work, it's common people who are going to praise it, it's common people who are going to pay money to see the Mona Lisa. If you have something like the Sears Tower, or like the Empire State Building, or like those towers that you have in Malaysia, or any wonderful building. You have Buckingham Palace, or you have Badshahi Mosque, or you have Shalimar Gardens. They have been made not for that person who commissioned it, or not for the individual who was responsible for making it. They have been made for you and for me, so that we can enjoy it, we can appreciate it. If we don't enjoy it, we don't appreciate it, and we don't praise that work, then it is useless, it's worthless. So who is important? We. Who is important? The man in the street, the individual. He is the most important person, because everything that has been done so that he can praise it, he can appreciate it, or he can utilize it. It's not for kings and queens and philosophers. So I am to settle its claims to praise. If I am not going to praise it, that work of art can stay in storage for years, for centuries, and it is worthless. The worth, the true value of any object or building or individual lies in the common man praising it, the common man utilizing it. And then he gives an example. He gives the example of this drunkard, this man who had drunk too much, and he just fell down in the street. Well, he was picked up, and this is a sort of story. He was picked up and he was taken to the Duke's house. He was washed, he was dressed in the Duke's clothes, and he was told that he was the Duke of such and such a place. Now, the drunk in the street is a drunk only because of what he has done at that time. But washed, dressed, and established in the Duke's palace, the individual becomes the Duke. I don't know if you people have seen that film. It's a classical English film, My Fair Lady, in which a professor of linguistics and phonetics takes on this flower girl from the street, and he says, if I teach her language, if I teach her to speak good English, and I dress her up in good clothes, I can pass her off as a princess, as a duchess. And they make a bet and he wins out. So an individual is what he is told he is. If you are a student, you're a student because I say you are a student. But if you are placed in a different capacity, when you go home, for example, you are a brother, a sister, a son, a daughter, a husband, a wife, a father or a mother. So here in class, you are students because you are studying and I am teaching. I'm a teacher here because I'm teaching you. But if I go out of this classroom, then I'm a different individual. So a person who is picked up and who is drunk and who is poor, if he is established in a duke's palace and he is told that he is the duke, well, he becomes the duke. And this is a very important example because we are defined by other people. You are a student because you are told that you are a student, so you have the status of a student. I am a teacher because I am told that I am to teach this class. So I become a teacher, I become a professor, but when I go out of this classroom, I become another individual. I become a mother, a housewife, a friend, a colleague. I can be so many different things. So what he's trying to say is that we need to give ownership to the individual, and it is only when we do that that we can really claim to be giving the individual his due place in society. Our reading is mendicant and sycophantic. In history, our imagination plays us false. Kingdom and lordship, power and estate are a gaudier vocabulary than private John and Edward in a small house and common day's work. But the things of life are the same to both. The sum total of both is the same. A wonderful example that he's giving here. He says you can call a person a king, a lord, a nobleman, a poor man, a beggar, a thief, a man in the street. He is whatever you call him. And a king, a prince, a nobleman is just a word in a language. In another language, he or she might be something different. So what he's trying to say is that all these titles, they do not mean anything. They have meaning, they have value only if and when another individual gives them value. You can be a king, but if you do not have a kingdom, if you do not have subjects, you can't be a king. You have to have people who call you king. You can't say, I am the king and nobody calls me king. You have to be given that value. You have to be given that importance. If I'm a wife, a mother, a daughter, it's because I am told that I am a wife. It's because my children call me mother. It's because my father or my mother calls me daughter. I cannot just be a daughter and have no parents. I can't be a wife and have no husband. I can't be a teacher and have no students. So without you, I do not have an existence, just as without me, you do not have any value. It works both ways. So he says just because a person is called a king does not mean anything. He has to show that he is a king. People have to call him your majesty, your highness, your lordship. If people don't call you your majesty, you can't be a king. So a person, a place, an object is important because people give it importance. It's not important in itself. Now here you'll see Emerson is presenting something that really makes you think. Objects, places, people, time have value only when they are given value. They, in themselves, they have nothing, they have no importance. So a king or a lord is the same as a John or an Abdulahad or a Shahina or an Abdul Rahman or a Sakina. You know, it's the same thing. It's just words that you're using. It's value that you're giving to that person. So their importance lies in the importance that you give them. Okay? So why all this deference to Alfred and Skanderbeg and Gustavus? Suppose they were virtuous. Did they wear out virtue? As great a stake depends on your private act today as followed their public and renowned steps. So the great people who are quoted to you, they weren't all that great. If you had been in their place, you would have done the same. People would have called you great. So it's not that they were born great. They did something and so they were called great. So he gives you examples of Alfred and Skanderbeg and Gustavus, etc. And he says that these people became important because they were given importance, not because they were born important. So whatever you're doing today is as important as anything that they did in their time and in their countries. The world has been instructed by its kings who have so magnetized the eyes of nations. It has been taught by this colossal symbol that mutual reverence is due from man to man. The joyful loyalty with which men have everywhere suffered the king, the noble, or the great proprietor to walk among them by a law of his own, make his own scale of men and things and reverse theirs, pay for benefits and not with money but with honor and represent the law in his person, was the hieroglyphic by which they obscurely signify their consciousness of their own right and comeliness, the right of every man. Okay. So, we have been made fools of by kings who told us that we were worthless. Remember what I said a while back about us having value because of the value that is given to us. So, kings for centuries oppressed the ordinary human beings by telling them that they were worthless, that they could not do anything, and that they, that is the kings, were superior to the ordinary human beings. So remember the bit about you being what you are told you are. So for centuries, he says, kings oppressed us by telling us that the ordinary people are worthless, they are useless, and that it's only kings who have any importance. All those references to a person having blue blood or being related to the aristocracy, they hold no value when confronted with Emerson's argument. So we need to think very carefully of our own importance, and we need to give value to ourselves. Okay. The magnetism which all original action exerts is explained when we inquire the reason of self-trust. And the first question that comes to the mind is, who is the trustee? What is the aboriginal self on which a universal reliance may be grounded? What is the nature and power of that science-baffling star without parallax, without calculable elements, which shoots a ray of beauty even into trivial and impure actions if the least mark of independence appear? And then he goes on to other things. Okay, so let's go back a bit. He says the magnetism which all original action exerts is explained when we inquire the reason of self-trust. Why must we trust ourselves? Why must we value ourselves? And this leads to a whole series of questions, one of which is, who is the trustee? Who is the individual who is trusted? And what is this self that must be relied on? Remember that the essay is titled Self-Reliance. So who and what is this self that must be relied on? Is it like a star, a science-baffling star which shoots its rays and illuminates the whole world? The sun is a star, and if you take the sun to be a star and to be the source of all light and all heat, then you have to wonder, what makes the sun the sun? What gives it that value? What gives it that importance? The inquiry leads us to that source, at once the essence of genius, of virtue, and of life, which we call spontaneity or instinct. We denote this primary wisdom as intuition, which all later teachings, while all later teachings are tuitions. In that deep force, the last fact behind which analysis cannot go, all things find their common origin. Okay. Now, Emerson is bringing in a very important point here when he talks about intuition and tuition. And he says that spontaneity or the instinct is what tells us whether something is responsible or not, whether someone is great or not. Spontaneity and instinct. And this, he says, is something that we are born with. there's a difference that he points out to between intuition and tuition. Intuition is what we are born with. Tuition is what is cultivated. You know, you use the word tuition to mean something that is taught, and intuition is something that you know instinctively, for which you don't have to cultivate any habits or anything like that. So intuition and tuition, these are the two most important criteria for judging whether someone or something is great or not. So in that deep force, all things find their common origin. You have to gauge everything on this chart that comprises of intuition and tuition. For the sense of being which in calm hour rises, we know not how in the soul, is not diverse from things, from space, from light, from time, from man, but one of them, and proceeds obviously from the same source whence their life and being also proceed. So, the sense of being which is in all of us and which arises in our calmer moments when we are at peace is something which proceeds from the same source from where we get life, from where we get being. So, if we say that we are great or the man in the street is great, it's because we call it great and therefore we give it greatness. Greatness is not something that you can just assume. Importance is not something that you can just take as a given. It has to be given to you. You have to be considered important by someone. We first share the life by which things exist and afterwards see them as appearances in nature and forget that we have shared their cause. He is the fountain of action and of thought. Here are the lungs of that inspiration which giveth man wisdom and which cannot be denied without impiety and atheism. We lie in the lap of immense intelligence which makes us receivers of its truth and organs of its activity. So, we share life, we share everything, and it's only when we have shared, when we have looked at things from a very impersonal aspect, that we are able to appreciate them. And then only can we give importance to these people or that time or those objects. Here is the fountain of action and of thought. You can't discriminate the value that you associate with an individual, with an object. Although Emerson breaks it up into many different parts and he says, you know, these are the most important parts of the whole. As he says, we lie in the lap of immense intelligence which makes us receivers of its truth and organs of its activity. So divine intelligence is what we all have our beings in, and all of us borrow something, borrow to a greater or lesser extent from this divine intelligence. We are what we are made to be, and therefore the importance that is given to us is what determines how important we are. When we discern justice, when we discern truth, we do nothing of ourselves but allow a passage to its beams. So when we talk about truth, and if you go back to the previous slide, he's talking about this divine intelligence. So he says that when we discern justice or truth, we're not doing anything ourselves. What we're doing is allowing that divine intelligence, that supreme intelligence, to come down to us, to establish a sort of link with us. And he says, if we ask from where this intelligence is coming or from where is this light coming, all philosophy is at fault. Nobody can give us an answer. So he's talking about this immense intelligence, this divine intelligence, and he says we cannot ask where it's coming. You know, we can give it different names. We can say it is divine providence. We can say Allah has blessed us with this. We can say God has given it to us. We can say that the Supreme Being is communicating with us. Yet Emerson says all of these answers would be wrong and all of them would be right, because we cannot determine whether we have a share in this immense intelligence or not. Other people can tell us. We cannot say for ourselves whether we have this intelligence in us or not. And here he is making a very important point. A lot of people claim to be certain things, claim to be able to do certain things. Emerson's point of view is that you cannot do that. You can't claim to be the most wonderful teacher, or you can't claim to be the most wonderful artist. People have to give you that title. They have to call you the most amazing teacher. I can't just go around saying, oh, I'm the most wonderful teacher in this country. I cannot do that. You can tell me whether I'm good or not. So you are giving me value or taking that value away from me. I can't do it to myself, just as you cannot say, oh, we are wonderful students, we are the most wonderful class that Dr. Shahina has always had. You can't do that. I have to be able to tell you that. Your examiners have to be able to say, oh, this batch of 2014 was the best, or the batch of 2018, or the batch of 1990 was the most wonderful class we've ever had. Your teachers have to tell you. Other people have to give you that credit or that blame. Every man discriminates between the voluntary acts of his mind and his involuntary perceptions, and knows that to his involuntary perceptions a perfect faith is due. He may err in the expression of them, but he knows that these things are so, like day and night, not to be disputed. My willful actions and acquisitions are but roving. The idlest reverie, the faintest native emotion, command my curiosity and respect. So, let's go back a bit. Emerson says that every individual is able to discriminate between what is planned and what is instinctive. It's not something that involves rocket science. Every human being, sane, sensible human being, can discriminate between the voluntary acts and the involuntary perceptions. And of the involuntary perceptions, Emerson says that a faith is one of the involuntary perceptions. You don't do that consciously. You just are involved and are impressed by the workings of a particular faith. So everything that happens with an individual, to an individual, is what commands respect. It's not something that can be that can be avoided or that can be actively ignored. It's just something that is. Thoughtless people contradict as readily the statements of perceptions as of opinions, or rather much more readily, for they do not distinguish between perception and notion. They fancy that I choose this to see this or that thing. If I see a trait, my children will see it after me, and in course of time, all mankind. Although it may chance no one has seen it before me, for my perception of it is as much of the fact as the sun. Okay. So it says people who don't think about things are very ready to contradict the ideas presented by other people, because they cannot distinguish between a perception and a notion. And they imagine that I'm using these words because these are words that are fashionable, or these are words that I should be using. But perception is not whimsical, it is fatal. If I see a trait, my children will see it after me. So whatever I observe today will be observed by my children. It's not something that goes away. It's not something that is transient. It's something that has a presence, and for me it is as important, as significant as the sun, because it's the source of all light, the source of all heat. Without the sun we would perish probably in seconds, because there would be no heat, no light, we would not be able to see anything, we would not be able to feel warm, and so it is as much a fact as the sun. The relations of the soul to the divine spirit are so pure that it is profane to seek to interpose helps. It must be that when God speaketh, he should communicate, not one thing, but all things, should fill the world with his voice, should scatter forth light, nature, time, souls, from the center of the present thought, and new date and new create the whole. So he moves the argument on to relationship between the divine spirit and the human body. So he says the relations of the soul to the divine spirit are so pure that it is profane to seek to interpose helps. You can't say that I'm going to plead on his behalf. You cannot do that. It's sacrilege. It's going against what is accepted in religious norms. So he says that when God speaks, he sends light. He throws light at us. If we choose to use that light, we can swim. But if we choose to ignore that light, then we have to be ready for any fatalities that occur. Whenever a mind is simple and receives a divine wisdom, old things pass away, means, teachers, texts, temples fall. It lives now and absorbs past and future into the present hour. So he says whenever a mind receives divine wisdom, it lives in the present. It lives in the present, and it absorbs whatever happened in the past, whatever can be foreseen in the future. It absorbs all of that into the present hour, into contextualizing it. All things are dissolved to this center by their cause, and in the universal miracle, petty and particular miracles disappear. So all things are subject to change, and when that change takes place, Emerson says that there are things that happen or things that come to me, and then they just disappear. So what he's trying to say here is that we must not give importance to outside sources, to outside forces, to external agencies. We need to live with ourselves, by ourselves, and for ourselves. We must not bow to anything else. If therefore a man claims to know and speak of God, and carries you backward to the phraseology of some old mouldered nation in another country, in another world, believe him not. Is the acorn better than the oak, which is its fullness and completion? Very interesting examples here. Is the parent better than the child, with whom he has cast his ripened being? Whence then this worship of the past? So he says, if a man claims to know God and to speak of God, and he gives you examples from Greek philosophy or from theology, and he quotes the Bible and he quotes the Quran, and he says, you know, older communities and nations were destroyed because you did not believe in the Holy Quran or in the Word of God. He says, do not listen to such people. Now, this is a very radical idea that Emerson is giving here, and that is that you have to experience everything for yourself. You cannot put on your experience to another person and say, okay, when he comes back from England, he'll tell me what he saw, and I'll write about it as if I went to England. Such things do not happen. And if such things do not happen, he says, how is it that you consider an acorn better than the oak? You know, the oak tree? The oak tree is old. It has a long life. It gives shade, and it has very good wood. The wood is used for making furniture. It's very expensive. So he says, how is it that you consider the acorn, which is a part of the oak tree, to be better? Because the acorn falls, is used up, the oak tree stands. So the oak tree is the man in the present time, in the present place. The acorn is the past which is gone. It says, is the parent better than the child into whom he has cast his ripened being? Now, this is something that you can debate about. Is the parent better than the child? The parent gives everything of its best to the child. And obviously the child then is better than the parent. But can you really say that the parent who lives in the past is better than the child who is living in the here and the now, in the present? If this is not so, why then do we worship the past? I'm going to end this lecture at this point, but I'm going to take you through the different arguments that Emerson presents in order to convince us that we need to rely on the self and not on the past. He's giving you certain examples, and he quotes examples from history, from politics, from literature, from world philosophy. If you remember, in a previous lecture, he had talked about putting your head over your shoulder. Now, when you do this, you're actually looking back, and that's something that Emerson is guarding us against. According to Emerson, we are too much in the habit of praising the past, of living in the past, and being impressed by people who are no more, being impressed by people who have been called kings and princes and lords and noblemen. Emerson says all this is rubbish, because when you call a person a king or a nobleman or a prince or a princess, he or she has that persona only because the ordinary person is giving that persona. Is not a king because he says he is. He's a king because we call him a king. In the same way, the great philosophers of the past, we borrow our ideas from them, and we do not give importance to the ordinary man, to the individual, to the common man. Whereas whatever is important, whether it is a person, a place, or a thing, is important only because the ordinary man gives it importance. And if the ordinary man does not give it that importance, does not call a person a king, for example, that person cannot be a king. You can't just go around saying, I'm the king, and you don't have any subjects. It's only when people talk about him, and it's only when people address him as your majesty, that he can be king. So the man in the street is the most important person. The time that is of the most important is here and now. This place is important. That place is not. Because this is here. This is where I'm sitting. This is where you're sitting. This class is the most important class. The class of, let's say, 2013 or 1999 was not important. This class, these students, this time is important, according to Emerson, because everything that is seen, everything that is gauged and judged, is gauged and judged in the perspective of the present moment by the ordinary man in the street in this particular place. So he says, don't give us examples of Greek philosophers and Greek men of letters and say that, you know, everything has its origin in Greek literature and Greek art. We need to see what the ordinary person is doing. We need to see what the ordinary person likes and dislikes. We cannot borrow examples from the past because the past is dead and gone. And towards the end of this essay, particularly where he brings in these examples of the acorn and the oak, of the parent and the child, he emphasizes the importance of the individual. He says we have to rely on ourself, and the self is what we make of it. The self is what people around us assign to us. The value that an individual holds, the value that an object or a place holds, is by virtue of who is giving that value. So if I am a teacher, I'm a teacher only because you are my students. If you are not here, I cannot exist in a vacuum. I cannot exist in isolation. I have to have a context. You have to call me teacher, otherwise I do not exist as a teacher. In the same way, I have to acknowledge you as students. I have to give you that importance, that value. Then only can you be students. You can't just say, I'm a student of ComSats. You have to follow a certain prescribed format for that. You have to enroll yourself. You have to register yourself, you have to pay the fee, you have to attend this class. You can't attend a class and still go around saying, I'm a student. That does not make you a student, just as the acorn is not better than the oak tree from which it has fallen, because the acorn only has life as long as it is attached with the oak. The moment it is dissociated from the oak, the moment it falls, is the moment it dies. It has value only because of the oak tree. So he says, how can we say that the acorn is better than the oak tree? We cannot say that, because the oak is the source of origin. The oak tree remains when the acorn goes. When the acorn falls, it dies, and that's the end. We can't go around harping on the importance of the acorn when the oak is there. The acorn is dead and gone. So in the same way, he says, when we say that the parent is better than the child, it is not justified, for the simple reason that the parents, in giving birth to the child, put the best, the maximum into the child. So the child obviously has the best of both parents and carries that forward. And if that is true, how then can we worship the past? How can we say that people who lived in the past were better? How can we say that the philosophers, the men of letters, the artists, the engineers, the scientists in the past were better than the ordinary people today? We have to have the man in the street. We have to acknowledge his worth. We have to give him value, because this man in the street is going to give value to the teachings and preachings of philosophers and artists and prophets. Without the ordinary man in the street, everything else becomes worthless. That's all for today. We're going to continue this essay in the next lecture also, and try to finish this essay so that we can go on with something else in this module. So thank you very much for your patience, and Allah Hafiz.